Hey everybody, I'm gonna read my book. I don't know why I'm wearing headphones. They don't help me read. Well, we've made it to chapter 4 and we're halfway through. Psychological effects of propaganda. Let us begin by examining what psychological effects propaganda operations have on the individual. Aside from the effects that propagandists seek to obtain directly, a person's vote, for example, his psychological manipulations evoke certain forces in the unconscious and traumatize the individual in various ways. A person subjected to propaganda does not remain intact or undamaged. Not only will his opinions and attitudes be modified, but also his impulses and his mental and emotional structures. Propaganda's effect is more than external. It produces profound changes. One must distinguish between different effects produced by different media. Each has its own effects on attitudes or opinions, whether the propagandist purposely provokes them or not. When a man goes to the movies, he receives certain impressions, and his inner life is modified independently of all propaganda. Such psychological effects or changes of opinion, specific to each of the communications media, join those specifically produced by propaganda operations. To analyze where one ends and the other begins is very difficult. If one looks at a propaganda campaign conducted by radio, it is almost impossible to divide its effects into those produced by the campaign and those produced by radio broadcasts in general. Many monographs have been written on the basic effects, independent of propaganda, of the press, radio, and TV, but the effects are also present when those media are used for propaganda. The propagandist cannot separate the general and specific effects. When he launches a radio campaign, he knows that the effects of his campaign and the effects of radio broadcasts in general will be combined. And as each medium has specific and partial effects, the propagandist will be tempted to combine them because they complement one another. Thus, the propagandist orchestrates. To study the psychological effects of propaganda, one would therefore have to study the effects of each of the communications media separately, and then the effects of their combination with the specific propaganda techniques. We cannot do this here, but the reader should at all times keep in mind this complementary character of propaganda. Psychological crystallization. Under the influence of propaganda, certain latent drives that are vague, unclear, and often without any particular objective suddenly become powerful, direct, and precise. Propaganda furnishes objectives, organizes the traits of an individual's personality into a system, and freezes them into a mold. For example, prejudices that exist about any event become greatly reinforced and hardened by propaganda. The individual is told that he is right in harboring them. He discovers reasons and justifications for a prejudice when it is clearly shared by many and proclaimed openly. Moreover, the stronger the conflicts in a society, the stronger the prejudices and propaganda that intensifies conflicts simultaneously intensifies prejudices in this very fashion. Once propaganda begins to utilize and direct an individual's hatreds, there's a footnote. Much more, this hardening of an individual's prejudices permits him to resist facts and the pressure of contrary events. Once propaganda begins to utilize and direct an individual's hatreds, he no longer has any chance to retreat, to reduce his animosities, or to seek reconciliations with his opponents. Moreover, he now has a supply of ready-made judgments where he had only some vague notions before the propaganda set in. And those judgments permit him to face any situation. He will never again have reason to change judgments that he will thereafter consider the one and only truth. In this fashion, propaganda standardizes current ideas, hardens prevailing stereotypes, and furnishes thought patterns in all areas. Thus, it codifies social, political, and moral standards. Of course, man needs to establish such standards and categories. The difference is that propaganda gives an overwhelming force to the process. Man can no longer modify his judgments and thought patterns. This force springs, on one hand, from the character of the media employed, which gives the appearance of objectivity to subjective impulses, and on the other, from everybody's adherence to the same standards and prejudices. There's a fuckload of footnotes for that paragraph. Holy shit. Propaganda gives the individual the stereotypes he no longer takes the trouble to work out for himself. It furnishes these in the form of labels, slogans, ready-made judgments. It transforms ideas into slogans, and by giving the word, convinces the individual that he has an opinion. Symbols are related to psychological phenomenon of the stereotype. A stereotype is a seeming value judgment acquired by belonging to a group without any intellectual labor and reproducing itself automatically with each specific simulation. The stereotype arises from feelings one has for one's own group or against the outgroup. Man attaches himself passionately to the values represented by his group and reflects the cliches of the outgroup. To share the prejudices of a group is only to demonstrate one's affiliation to this group. Stereotypes correspond to situations which the individual occupies in society, to his groups and his meteor. What does that word mean? Meteor. Looking up words and shit. Meteor. Oh, trade, profession, or occupation. No, I lost my place. Okay. Stereotypes correspond to situations which the individual occupies in society, to his groups and his profession. The stereotype, Stoetzel says, is a genuine category, a manner of thinking, of interpreting experience, of behaving, but founded solely on affective reactions. The stereotype is specific. It relates to a given name or image, which must be precise in order for the stereotype to work. The stereotype, which is stable, helps man to avoid thinking, to take a personal position, to form his own opinion. Man reacts constantly, as if by reflex, in the presence of the stimulus invoking the stereotype. This reflex permits him to have a ready-made, though apparently spontaneous, opinion in any situation. In fact, it gives him the sense of a situation, and with regard to an ethical problem, the stereotype is the criterion of values. It is usually formed in a limited group, but tends to develop, to extend itself to an entire collective. It is endowed with a force of expansion. Moreover, it gradually detaches itself from the primordial images that have aroused it and takes on a life of its own. In propaganda, existing stereotypes are awakened by symbols. The symbol permits the formation of a favorable response that can be transferred to persons and objects associated with it. To ask a group what it thinks of some sentence written by Victor Hugo results in the Hugo stereotype. But to ask their opinion of the same sentence without giving the author evokes no stereotype and elicits a very different opinion. In bourgeois milieu, the proposition bourgeoisie milieu, the proposition communism desires justice provokes an unfavorable reaction. But the reaction is favorable among parties that stress justice. Here the stereotype justice wins out. In the former case, it is the stereotype communism that is dominant. If we adopt Lasswell's analysis, we can divide symbols into three categories. There are symbols of demand, which express the aspirations of a group seeking to produce events. Then symbols of identification, which define the protagonist who acts for us, or the antagonist against whom we act. Finally, symbols of expectation, which present facts as immediate or future objectives, but facts that are, in reality, abstracts of themselves and have become simple symbols. The use of symbols divides the individual conscious against itself. Effective propaganda uses multiple symbols linked in such a way that some evoke known images and appeal to the conscious, whereas others violate the conscious and tend to destroy it or deny it. The symbol is an effective instrument for progressively separating the individual from primitive impulses, from his natural attitudes, and from creating counter attitudes and for creating counter attitudes and counter behaviors. By this procedure, propaganda succeeds in weakening the individual's conscious and consciousness and in unsettling individual attitudes during a period of transition with a view to furnishing them with a new content. One does not, for example, destroy symbols of authority in order to substitute an attitude of independence. One replaces them with new symbols of authority, but this use of symbols presumes a very advanced propaganda. It is what we find, for example, in Stalinist propaganda. At a much more elementary stage, all symbols have the purpose of awakening stereotypes, an appropriate function because by their nature they already unite the emotional and the intellectual life. The function is served by photos and images, which have special power to evoke the reality and immediacy of the stereotype, itself an image. It is fed by certain other images. The Statue of Liberty, the Arc de Triomphe provoke immediate reactions. The photo carries with it intrinsic qualities of the situation that it represents, and thereby reinforces the stereotype while stimulating it. Another particularly evocative symbol is the slogan, which contains the demands and the expectations, the hopes of the mass, and at the same time expresses the established values of a group. Slogans determine, with considerable precision, each type of group toward which an individual is orientated, whether or not he is a member. Make America Great Again. Above all, the slogan assures the continuity of the stereotype, which is fixed as a function of the past, but the individual finds himself constantly faced with new situations that the stereotype alone does not permit him to master. The slogan is the connection used by the propagandist to permit the individual to apply his old stereotypes to a new situation. He brushes up and adjusts the ready-made image at the same time. He integrates a new situation into a classic context, familiar and unconfusing. This is why the slogan furnishes in times of crisis, war, and revolution. It explains also the attraction the slogan has. Thanks to it, the individual is not intellectually lost. He clings to it not only because the slogan is easy to understand and to retain, but also because it permits him to find himself in it. It tends further to produce stereotypes in men who did not have them before the crisis situation. Man works out these simplifications spontaneously in order to avoid effort, error, and difficult choices. That is referencing to... Okay. And what else? We shall have what Alfred Saave calls error by force, or an effective error. Although the opinion and judgment are incorrect, they become unimpeachable through the strength of collective belief. Error by force or effective error. So, if a lie becomes popular, it becomes, even if it's incorrect, it becomes unimpeachable. That was a long-ass footnote. Holy shit. At the same time, these collective beliefs, which the individual assumes to be his own, these scales of values and stereotypes, which play only a small part in the psychological life of a person unaffected by propaganda, become big and important. And by the process of crystallization, these images begin to occupy a person's entire consciousness and to push out other feelings and judgments. All truly personal activity on the part of the individual is diminished, and man, finally, is filled with nothing but these prejudices and beliefs around which all else revolves. In his personal life, man will eventually judge everything by such crystallized standards. To return to Stoetzel, public opinion within an individual grows as it becomes crystallized through the effects of propaganda, while his private opinion decreases. Another aspect of crystallization pertains to self-justification, for which man has great need, as we have seen in the preceding chapter. To the extent that man needs justifications, propaganda provides them. But whereas his ordinary justifications are fragile and may always be open to doubts, those furnished by propaganda are irrefutable and solid. The individual believes them and considers them to be eternal truths. He can throw off all sense of guilt. He loses all feeling for the harm he might do, all sense of responsibility other than the responsibility propaganda instills in him. Thus, he becomes perfectly adapted to objective situations, and nothing can create a split within him. On the contrary, he attributes to the enemy exactly the atrocities that he himself is in the process of committing. Oh, projection. Yeah. Yep. Everyone does that. Through such a process of intense rationalization, propaganda builds monolithic individuals. It eliminates inner conflicts, tensions, self-criticism, self-doubt. And in this fashion, it also builds a one-dimensional being without depth or range of possibilities. Such an individual will have rationalizations not only for past actions, but for the future as well. He marches forward with full assurance of his righteousness. He is formidable in his equilibrium, all the more so because it is very difficult to break his harness of justifications. Experiments made with Nazi prisoners proved this point. Tensions are always a threat to the individual, who tries everything to escape them because of his instinct of self-preservation. Ordinarily, the individual will try to reduce his own tensions in his own way, but in our present society, Many of these tensions are produced by the general situation, and such tensions are less easily reduced. One might almost say that for collective problems, only collective remedies suffice. Here propaganda renders spectacular service. By making man live in a familiar climate of opinion, and by manipulating his symbols, it reduces tensions. Propaganda eliminates one of the causes of tensions by driving man straight into such a climate of opinion. This greatly simplifies his life and gives him stability, much security, and a certain satisfaction. At the same time, this crystallization closes his mind to all new ideas. The individual now has a set of prejudices and beliefs as well as objective justifications. His entire personality now revolves around those elements. Every new idea will therefore be troublesome to his entire being. He will defend himself against it because it threatens to destroy his certainties. He thus actually comes to hate everything opposed to what propaganda has made him acquire. Propaganda has created in him a system of opinions and tendencies which may not be subjected to criticism. That system leaves no room for ambiguity or mitigation of feelings. The individual has received irrational certainties from propaganda, and precisely because they are irrational, they seem to him part of his personality. He feels personally attacked when these certainties are attacked. There is a feeling here akin to that of something sacred, and this genuine taboo prevents the individual from entertaining any new ideas that might create ambiguity within him. What Sauvé calls the reactions of defense against the destroyer, security of the myth. Incidentally, this refusal to listen to new ideas usually takes on an ironic aspect. The man who has been successfully subjected to a vigorous propaganda will declare that all new ideas are propaganda. To the degree that all his stereotypes, prejudices, and justifications are the fruit of propaganda, man will be ready to consider all other ideas as being propaganda and to assert his distrust in propaganda. One can almost postulate that those who call every idea that they do not share propaganda are themselves almost completely products of propaganda. Their refusal to examine and question ideas other than their own is characteristic of their condition. That is fucking good. Their refusal to examine and question ideas other than their own is characteristic of their condition. So everyone, it's easy like for people to be critical of ideas they don't have, but they can't analyze or be self-critical of like their own ideas. One might go further and say that propaganda tends to give a person a religious personality. All this, of course, confirmed by the religious character that propaganda readily takes on, which tends to create the sacred around man and make him adhere to sacred values. His psychological life is organized around an irrational, external, and collective tenet that provides a scale of values, rules of behavior, and a principle of social integration. In a society in the process of secularization, propaganda responds to the religious need, but lends much more vigor and intransigence to the resulting religious personality. Intransigence? Refusal to change.
Intransigence.
I guess I do need headphones to read. Shit. How do I pronounce word?
Intransigence.
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 I pronounced it correctly. I am proud of myself. It means refusal to change your ideas. And now I lost my spot. In society, in the process of secularization, propaganda responds to the religious need, but lends much more vigor and intransigence, which means refusal to change your views, to the resulting religious personality, in the pejorative sense of that term, as liberals employed it in the 19th century. A limited and rigid personality that mechanically applies divine commandments, is incapable of engaging in human dialogue, and will never question values that it has placed above the individual. Dude, that is so true. That's why, like, I there's no, like, all these, like, debates and conversations. They're not fucking, it's not dialogue. It's, like, one person preaching, then no one's listening to the guy preaching except for people that agree with him. And then someone else preaches, and everyone ignores what they say except for the people that agree with it. It's just people preaching at each other. They're not even listening to each fucking. They don't even listen to each other. But it's a conversation. If I don't listen and I just preach what I think, don't respond to person. All this is produced by propaganda, which pretends to have lost none of its humanity, to act for the good of mankind, and to represent the highest type of human being. In this respect, strict orthodoxies always have been the same. We may now ask, if propaganda modifies the psychological life in this fashion, will it not eventually lead to neurosis? Karen Horney deserves the credit for having shown that the neurotic personality is tied to a social structure of a culture in the American sense of that term, and that certain neuroses share certain essential characteristics springing from the problems found in our society. And then there's a footnote. Oh, it's her book, The Neurotic Personality of Our Time. Chapter 1. In the face of problems produced by society, propaganda seems as a means of remedying personal deficiencies. At the same time, it plunges the individual into a neurotic state. This is apparent from the rigid responses of the propagandee, his unimaginative and stereotyped attitude, his sterility with regard to the socio-political process, his inability to adjust to situations other than those created by propaganda, his need for strict opposites, black and white, good and bad, his involvement in unreal conflicts created and blown up by propaganda. To mistake an artificial conflict for a real one is a characteristic of neurosis. So is the tendency of the propagandee to give everything his own narrow interpretation, to deprive facts of their real meaning in order to integrate them into his system, and to give them an emotional coloration, with the non-neurotic would not attribute to them. Which the non-neurotic would not attribute. I should read this whole fucking sentence. To mistake an... Okay. So is the tendency of the propagandee to give everything his own narrow interpretation, to deprive facts of their real meaning in order to integrate them into his system and give them an emotional coloration, which the non-neurotic would not attribute to them. To deprive facts of their real... So, like, the person who's propagandized deprives facts of their real meaning, and so you integrate facts that go against your like myths, and you alter them. You give facts attributes which people who aren't neurotic wouldn't, so you can integrate them into your fucking system of belief. Similarly, the neurotic anxiously seeks the esteem and affection of the largest number of people, just as the propagandee can live only in accord with his comrades, sharing the same reflexes and judgments with those of his group, subjected to the identical propaganda. He does not deviate by one iota, for to remove himself from the affection of the milieu means profound suffering, and that affection is tied to a particular external behavior and an identical response to propaganda. Naturally, what corresponds to this is the neurotic's hostility toward those who refuse his friendship and those who remain outside his group. The same holds true for the propagandee. In the neurotic, the extraordinary need for self-justification, which resides in everyone and leads him to insincerity, expresses itself in the projection of hostile motives to the outside world. He feels that destructive impulses do not emanate from him, but from someone or something outside him. He does not want to fool or exploit others. Others want to do that to him. And this mechanism is reproduced by propaganda with great precision. He who wants to make his war projects this intention onto his enemy, then the projected intention spreads to the propagandee, who is then being mobilized and prepared for war, whose hostilities are aroused at the same time as he is made to project his own aggression onto the enemy. As with the neurotic, the victim-enemy-scapegoat cycle assumes enormous proportions in the mind of the propagandee. Even if we admit that in addition to this process, some legitimate reasons always exist for such reactions. To sum up, when reading Karen Horney's description of the neurotic cycle stemming from the neurotic's environment, one might almost be reading the cycle typical for the propagandee: anxiety, hostility, reduction of self-respect, striving for power, reinforcement of hostility and anxiety, a tendency to withdraw in the face of competition, accompanied by tendencies to self-deprecation, failures and disproportion between capabilities and accomplishments, reinforcement of feelings of superiority, reinforcement of grandiose ideas, increase of sensitivity with an inclination to withdraw, increase of hostility and anxiety. These responses of the neurotic are identical with those of the propagandee, even if we take into account that the propaganda ultimately eliminates conscious anxiety and tranquilizes the propagandee. Whoa! That shit is heavy, man. Okay. I'm done reading for today. Maybe I'll read more later. If I feel like it.